Good morning and welcome, everyone. So welcome to day 6 of the hearing for the Victoria Murray Floodplain Restoration Project Environmental Effects Statement for the EES Central package relating to Belsa-Yungarra and Hatter Lakes North. As parties are aware, this hearing is being audio recorded. And my name is Lisa Kendall. I'm chair of the committee considering EES Central, joined today by Member Kirsch as deputy chair, Member Bell and Dr. Brisker. Dr. Brisker will be with us for this morning's ecology cross-examination. Then she will leave the hearing for the rest of the day, and Member Ham will be joining us for the bushfire evidence, and will sit with the committee for the remainder of the day. In terms of today's timetable, we'll be moving into cross-examination of Mr. Holmes shortly on terrestrial ecology relating to fauna, and then we'll be hearing from Mr. George on bushfire, so experts called by the proponent. I don't have any other documents received to note following from yesterday. We do have a question that I will just hand to Dr. Brisker, which is a follow-up question regarding the water management area scenarios that were discussed yesterday. So I'll hand to Dr. Brisker to do that now.
Thank you, Member Kendall. This question follows on from a question I raised yesterday with Ms. Jelly, in which Mr. Townsend responded to about presentation slides 33 and 35 in Ms. Jelly's presentation. Slide 33 shows 3 water management areas for Belsa-Yungarra and shows the residual effects of the project on those 3 water management WMAs, and 35 shows 2, the Chalker North WMA and Lake Bulka. And my question was initially why only 3, not 4 water management areas were represented on slide 33, on the assumption that those were in fact spatial water management areas, and Mr. Townsend's response was that they may well be scenarios rather than water management areas spatially, but from slide 35 they appear to actually be spatial areas by the nature of the description. So to avoid any uncertainty, I'm seeking clarification as to what the WMAs actually are. Are they scenarios and or spatial locations? And if they are spatial locations, why there is nothing for water management area 1 in Belsa-Yungarra? I might also add that my question relates not only to those presentation slides, but also to figures 7.3 and 10.3 in the specialist assessment report for terrestrial ecology, which is where they're derived from. And there are also 2 tables that are closely related and presented together with those figures, table 7.17 and table 10.19 in the specialist assessment report. So to be able to fully understand those figures and tables, we need to understand what the WMAs are in that context.
Thank you, Dr. Brisker. Mr. Townsend, I'm happy for you to respond to that at an appropriate time, sometime later in the hearing. I expect there's a little bit that you'll need to work through there. Thank you. So this morning, just to run through a couple of preliminary matters, or one more before I open up to see whether there are any other questions or preliminary matters this morning. So we do have parties cross-examining Mr. Holmes this morning. So we've got Ms. Hogan representing Environment Victoria and Dr. Kelly. So if I can just check that they are given presenter status for when that time comes, and also confirmation that we've only been advised by Environment Victoria that they intend to cross-examine Mr. George. So we don't have any other parties who've indicated an intent at this stage. So I'll now open the floor for any other preliminary matters. So I'll come to you, Mr. Townsend, for starters.
No preliminary matters, but it'll save me saying this at the end of the day to let you know that on the assumption we get through Mr. George today, what you'll get from us on Monday is some further responses. But in that covering, what we'll do is give you a covering email with that bundle on Monday that shows you where outstanding questions are. And what we're trying to do is organise those into those which require a response from an expert as such, or those where we said we'd come back to you with an answer, in which case we'll collect all those and they can go in our Part C submission later. So we hope to give you some direction about that, so you clearly know where you're at on Monday with that. I was going to say that at the end of the day, but that will save me doing it then. The only other matter from me is I had neglected to put one matter to Mr. Holmes, so before cross-examination, I'd like to be able to put one more matter when it's convenient.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Could I confirm, Mr. Townsend, when you're talking about Monday, you meaning that would be provided in written form or correspondence to the committee rather than in hearing?
Oh, yes, I beg your pardon. What I meant was, on the assumption Mr. George finishes and you won't be sitting Monday, we're letting you know that on Monday you will receive on the email some RFI, a next batch, and there'll be a covering email with that, just so you know by the time you start on Tuesday where we stand with all outstanding matters.
Excellent. Thank you. That's clear. So I'll just ask if any party has a question, and I understand that parties are still able to raise their virtual hand. So if you do, please do that, and I'll come to you. And it doesn't look like we do, so we'll move straight into your submissions, Mr. Townsend. I'll hand to you before we do go to cross-examination, as you just indicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll check you there, Mr. Holmes.
Thanks, Mr. Townsend. I'm here.
Thank you. And when we concluded last night, you'd been responding to submissions and including some comments made on the butterfly through the evidence you'd seen from Ms. Murdoch. And there was a matter I needed to show you by going back to the Specialist Assessment B report. Mr. Forrest is going to share the relevant pages. And we'll start, if I might, Mr. Forrester, just with it's the section that concerns your predicted responses to long-term watering for fauna. And at page 559, you explain your categories of the responses according to particular species that you then apply in subsequent tables, which I'll show you in a moment. But just looking at the categories, strongly positive is described as a great benefit, positive where you expect to benefit for the reasons you've set out there under positive. And you say for neutral, it's not expected to change the availability or condition of habitat or breeding opportunities, influence existing declines in habitat availability or condition, and populations would not be expected to change. Then you've got negative, where you'd have an adverse effect by killing individuals or decreasing availability or condition of habitat, etc. And then you say for the do nothing scenario, another category is used, current trajectory, which is the continuation of the decline. I just wanted to show you those before going, as a refresher for the committee, before going to my question. So if Mr. Forrester now takes us to the next page, which is 560, we see the start of the table. And the first thing I think, which is evident and reasonably self-explanatory, is that you've then set out the areas, and according to scenarios, which are the I first am going to ask you, are those scenarios according to the modelled scenarios of the extent of inundation, as in terms of the amount of flow provided in the scenarios, heading from a lower flow scenario to the higher flow scenario? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
And in doing that, you go then through the faunal group identified on the left, and you give a confidence about your the confidence in your response, which ranges from medium to high throughout. The default column, the do nothing for all faunal groups, is subject to I'll show you, shows a decline in the current trajectory, or the do nothing case. And the balance, as we'll see, apart from the two I'm going to show you, are positive or strongly positive, depending on the attachment of the species it seems to, or the group, to water itself. So I'll leave that as, I think, self-explanatory. I wanted to show you two groups. The first was the Victorian Mallee bird community, which is at 561. The next page, Mr. Forrester, which is the first you describe as neutral with a low medium confidence in your response throughout. Can we summarise that by reference to answers you gave yesterday about those species of birds that visit but visit much broader areas and are seen occasionally in the area but not necessarily permanently within the area? Was that? I'm sorry about my language, but
no, that's okay. So that Victorian Mallee bird communities, obviously present in northwest Victoria, but there are no Mallee habitats within the inundation area or construction footprint. So some of those species would obviously occur or occasionally occur within those floodplain areas, but it would just be it's not necessarily going to benefit or negatively impact on that Mallee bird community. So hence the neutral result for that community.
All right. Now, the other neutral result you gave was for the Mildura gyrus butterfly, which is at the bottom of the same table. And we understood your evidence, so it's inundated now, and therefore it was an impact of inundation, not the projects as such, but it would be lost where it occurs in the MIA. But I just wanted you to explain why you've selected for the long-term response a neutral.
Well, I mean, look, we expect it would be a neutral impact. It's obviously not a water-dependent species, so we've said neutral impact because there's obviously natural flooding occurring in that area regardless. We don't know. I mean, research, we know that species only uses oviposition sites on living trees, so it's possible it could have a positive benefit down the track, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that. So we've said neutral in that case, because as I mentioned yesterday, it's opportunistically using those habitats in the floodplain as oviposition sites at the moment. So, but that is subject to natural flooding. So.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you, Member Kendall. I'm sorry I forgot that one yesterday, but that is now the evidence in chief.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend, and welcome to Mr. Holmes. Thank you. We'll move straight into cross-examination. I'll ask if Ms. Hogan from representing Environment Victoria. Thank you. I can see you have your camera on. So you may have. I have my notes in front of the screen there for a moment. Ms. Hogan, just to confirm, you've estimated around 20 minutes worth of questions. Is that still what we're heading towards?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, lovely. I'll hand directly to you and you can ask your questions of Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Mr. Holmes. Thank you for your presentation yesterday.
No problem.
My first question relates to the Regent parrot specifically. In Appendix K to the specialist assessment, where you've talked about the parrot, you've noted that while this project will impact on potential habitat within the area defined as critical habitat, it is expected to have a minor impact on the Regent parrot itself, given the type of habitat to be impacted and the way this species uses that habitat relative to other more favoured habitats. And also that relative to habitat availability in the immediate and surrounding areas, the proposed loss of habitat for this species is proportionately small, and therefore the impact is considered to not be significant. I know you've spoken about the nesting of that species at Belsa Island. Specifically, when you talk about habitat availability in the immediate and surrounding areas, are you aware of whether any of that known or potential habitat falls within the project areas of the other VMFRP proposed sites?
What I'm referring to there is, as I mentioned yesterday, the parrot it's quite mobile, so it will use adjacent mallee habitats for foraging, and in the non-breeding season they'll disperse into those mallee habitats. Quite a long way, maybe up to 50, 80, 100 kilometres from their breeding habitats. So you'll find them out in the big desert, out in Murray Sunset, Wyperfeld National Park. They will disperse a long way. So I think what we're referring to there more relates to, so there will be a loss of other habitats. So that's more around foraging, perching, roosting. But what we're saying there is there's a large area of available habitat surrounding that site that the birds continue to use, and the project won't affect in any way. So they do use two different types of habitats. I mean, similar to the superb parrot, which is related, they'll nest in a particular type of habitat and then they'll forage in other nearby habitats, but travelling quite a distance into those other areas. So that's really what we're referring to there.
Right, thank you. So when you talk about, in your presentation, you talked about the parrots being highly mobile and foraging outside of the floodplain, as you've just stated. So your reference to outside of the floodplain is different types of environments. So outside, for example, all of the VMFRP project sites, all 9 floodplains. Yeah.
Potentially, yes. They do move a good distance into mallee habitats. Yeah.
Thank you. And are you aware of whether any potentially critical habitat, and that's critical habitat within the definition of the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, whether any of that critical habitat could or does occur for other species within these project sites?
Critical habitat, sorry, do you mind repeating that again, Ms. Hogan?
Yes.
Critical
yes,
habitat for other species, do you mean? Or?
Yes, whether there's been any consideration of potentially critical habitat for other species within the project sites.
Oh, we've definitely considered other critical habitat for other species, yes, definitely.
Thank you. My next question, a few questions relate to the loss of hollow bearing trees across the project sites.
Yes.
In the specialist assessment and in your expert statement at paragraph 5.18, you've explained in some detail that hollow replacement has been considered, and it was determined that it was unlikely to provide the mitigation it proposed to achieve, and that this conclusion was reached in part by applying the learnings from the Living Murray project at Hatter, where observations suggested that the regent parrot nestlings may have overheated in poorly insulated nest boxes, and that other birds were tending to prefer natural hollows in the area. You have identified that a hollow replacement plan could be beneficial, and consideration could be given to securing naturally hollow limbs from felled trees to living trees that will remain in the floodplain. Are you able to explain a bit further the type of mitigation that hollow replacement is intended to achieve?
Okay, so I guess my comment was, so loss of hollows won't significantly impact on any specific species. That was our conclusion. We did acknowledge that loss of hollows is an impact, but I also went on to say that I don't disagree with a hollow replacement strategy, but I do disagree with the 1-to-1 ratio. I think that's unachievable. So I did go on to say if something like that was considered, it would need to be done properly. So you wouldn't just put up some nest boxes, which just simply won't work in these environments. It would need to be carefully researched, and we'd need to be looking at, you need to be looking at things like carved or natural hollows, properly insulated, and a program that would be properly monitored as well. So that was what I said. So I'm not saying I disagree with that. In some situations, I didn't think it was really necessary. I don't think you need to have that as mitigation, but if it was to be done, it would have to be done properly. That was my conclusion.
So just to clarify, is it a mitigation measure that you're recommending for either of the project sites?
I haven't recommended that, no.
Thank you. And to what extent have you specifically considered the potential loss of or disturbance to climate and drought refuges for species caused by the removal of those trees or by construction activities or otherwise?
Look, that certainly comes into consideration, but as I said yesterday, it's like in the context of these sites, they're such large sites, it's really quite small what we're talking about in terms of removal. So yes, we have considered that. Yeah, I've visited these sites during droughts, and it's certainly in the front of my mind when we're looking at those sort of things. But in the context of the broader habitat, they're small losses overall.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. My next questions relate to the cumulative impacts of these projects, and we touched on this a bit earlier. You touched on this in relation to the Regent Parrot, but more broadly in relation to cumulative effects at Section 11 of the Specialist Assessment. To what extent were you asked to, or did you consider the cumulative impacts of all 9 VMFRP projects on terrestrial fauna?
Yeah, it most certainly did. So considered the cumulative effects of all 9 projects in addition to other major projects happening along the Murray. So that was all taken into consideration for cumulative effects, yes.
Thank you. And to what extent were you asked to consider impacts on terrestrial fauna outside of those 9 floodplain sites?
Outside of those 9 floodplain sites? Yeah, as I suggested before, we also took into account other major projects. So yes, also sites outside those 9 sites, the 9 VMFRP sites, yes.
Thank you. Turning to a few questions about traditional owner consultation. And it's the same question that was posed to Ms. Jelly, so I appreciate that your answer might be similar, but to what extent has your assessment of impacts on terrestrial fauna in relation to the projects taken into account the specific aspirations of traditional owners in relation to terrestrial fauna?
Yeah, look, it's a similar sort of answer to Zoe, I guess. Look, Ms. Jelly, we did intend to have traditional owners out on site during the fauna surveys, but unfortunately, due to COVID at that time, we weren't able to do that. But there was intention of and I have done this in the past on other surveys. So I mentioned the 2013 baseline surveys we undertook. We had traditional owners out on site, and that's something I would typically do on a fauna survey. Wherever I did it, I'd try to engage with traditional owners. So look, we did make attempts to do that. Unfortunately, the circumstances meant that we couldn't do that. But there's also, I'm quite known, because I've lived in Mildura since 2000, so I mean, I'm quite known to a lot of the traditional owners in the region, so they do like to share various observations with me. So I have had some observations come through from traditional owners helping with the cultural heritage work. I had a carpet python observation come through on one of the sites, so there is some knowledge sharing going on there as well. So certainly attempt to take that on board wherever I can. So,
thanks, Mr. Holmes. And in relation to that knowledge sharing, was any of that in relation to the cultural significance of particular animals for traditional owners, including any totem animals?
Oh, look, I do understand what some of the totem animals are locally anyway, so I would sort of take that into account during my surveys. So yeah, I am aware of what some of the totems are.
Thank you. And similar question, but about the management of pests and weeds in the areas. Was traditional owner knowledge incorporated in your assessment or your any mitigation measures proposed for that management?
In terms of pests? Look, certainly we definitely took into account the impact of rabbits. When rabbits do impact on cultural sites, so we certainly have that front of mind. They also provide food for carpet pythons, so there's lots of intertwining requirements there. So yeah, we're definitely across those sorts of impacts of pests. So it's definitely front of mind when we're doing these assessments. So certainly consider that.
Thanks, Mr. Holmes. My next few questions relate to the assessment of benefits, and I wonder the extent to which you might be able to comment in chapters 5 and 6 relating to the overall improvement of biodiversity for the 2 project sites. Table 12 in each of those chapters provides an assessment of the amount in hectares of habitat for threatened species that is expected to benefit versus the amount that could potentially be impacted.
Yep.
Are you able to explain the basis on which the number of hectares potentially benefited is expected to potentially benefit was calculated? So, for example, whether that's calculated in accordance with known habitat or potential future habitat and the likelihood of that benefit occurring?
Look, I may need to take that on notice just to get some more detail, but I believe we used we typically would use ecological vegetation classes. So that sort of, we'd use that as a basis. We'd look at species records from an area, distribution of the species through the various habitats, but we'd also look at, we'd predict what EVCs each of the species would utilise and make some assumptions based on that. So I guess in some respects, it's more sort of habitat modelling, I guess, in terms of what habitats they might use. So they were calculated from those types of things. I mean, for species like growling grass frog, you would assume wherever you're going to apply water would potentially provide habitat for that species. Some of the others were EVC based. But I might just double check that though, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. And my next question related to the growling grass frog in part. So in
Ms. Hogan, sorry, can I just...
Yes, Mr. Townsend.
That chapter 5.6, the document you're referring to, can you just clarify which document you were actually referring to when you were talking about that habitat hectare?
Certainly.
Yeah.
It's table 12 in those chapters, in each of those chapters.
Chapters of?
Chapters of the EES document. So chapters 5
Specialist
and 6.
report, yeah. Yep.
Chapters 5 and 6 relating to overall improvement to biodiversity.
Sorry, and for my benefit, Ms. Hogan, that doesn't relate to it's not the specialist assessment you're referring to.
It's not the specialist assessment, no.
Okay, yeah, right. So that's, I didn't write that other document, so I can't really comment on on that document.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You have, I think, referenced it in a particular part of it in your expert statement in relation to the growling grass frog, and I think that was in response to comments made in the public submissions.
Oh, okay, yes.
So the reference, I believe, was in relation to the comment in those chapters that for the growling grass frog, 1,351 hectares of habitat could be potentially benefited, compared to 32 hectares that could be potentially impacted. And you've said that while the anticipated benefits may be seen as overstated and ambitious, the potential impacts are also likely to be overstated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no records from that site, so it's pretty negligible whether there's impacts to growling grass frog or not. So
certainly. Is it the case then that the anticipated benefits to the regent parrot and the Australian painted snipe could also be overstated for the same reason?
Oh, look, I doubt very much. I don't see why they'd be overstated. Regent parrot in particular, we know is present, and we can, and we have a good understanding of what habitats they'll use, what ecological vegetation classes they'll use. So I can't understand why that would be overstated. And same with the painted snipe. I mean, they're quite opportunistic users of wetland habitat. So again, it's difficult to predict whether they'll use those areas or not. But if you provide wetland habitat, they're just as likely to use that. So.
Thanks, Mr. Holmes. My next question relates to the butterfly, the Mildura butterfly. I won't attempt its Latin name. The Federal Conservation Advice for that species identifies that information required and research priorities included assessing the feasibility and need for translocation to secure habitat already managed for conservation purposes. I wonder if you could explain whether translocation was considered as a potential strategy to mitigate any risks to the butterfly as part of these projects.
It wasn't considered. I don't know how you would achieve that when it's such a specialised microhabitat that the butterfly uses. I don't know what you'd be translocating. Mm-hmm. The only thing you could do is take eggs and incubate them somewhere else or off-site, and you couldn't translocate it. It's not a feasible option.
Thanks, Mr. Holmes. And just two final questions on construction. So EDS E2G, which you spoke about in your presentation in relation to site-specific additional measures, identifies that in order to avoid and minimise impacts to the regent parrot specifically, the removal, lopping or felling of active nesting trees, if required, must be done outside of the breeding season, which is identified to be August to December inclusive.
Yes.
In your view, if project construction were to be done during the breeding season, are the measures proposed in that EDS sufficient to mitigate the risks to that species?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion about this. So this has been discussed at length. So as I suggested for that EDS, I mean, I should add to I guess to start with. So multi-year surveys have been conducted at these sites. There's no nesting. We haven't confirmed any nesting within the construction footprints. So Ms. Jelly did talk about the workshops that we did initially, and I did mention that. So the known nesting habitat along Gearbox Loop, the track was removed from that area in Yungara Island. So we've undertaken a series of different mitigating measures to attempt to mitigate any impacts on that species. And then we carefully considered what sort of buffer we would apply if any active nests were detected. So that 350 metre buffer, yes, I believe would be sufficient to buffer those. If parrots were seen to be nesting in the vicinity of construction, that 350 metre buffer would be sufficient.
Thanks, Mr. Holmes. And were you briefed on the specific construction methods and plans that are proposed for these projects? Yes, and I've been involved in a lot of these sorts of projects, so I understand how these things take place. I've witnessed the development on site. I've been on the ground during these projects, so I understand what happens. Thanks, Mr. Holmes. That was my final question. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ms. Hogan. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. I'll ask Dr. Kelly if she could please join us on the screen. Great, thank you. Welcome, Dr. Kelly. I'll hand directly to you to ask your questions of Mr. Holmes.
Thank you. Mr. Holmes, I'll just ask a few questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
With, you say you've seen lots of these projects, typical projects, with the change in the way the floodplain functions when one of these projects is done, does that have, you know, it's quite a different thing. Watching the recent floods start to occur, the river rises and then begins to trickle into the creeks and flood runners, and it's all very gentle and silent and gradual. With one of these projects, it changes that quite significantly and it becomes a different process. What effect does that have on the fauna, or does it have none at all?
Look, in answering that question, I mean, it depends on what you deem gentle. I mean, breakouts in the Warkle, anything but gentle, I would have thought. But yeah, look, it is somewhat different in terms of delivery of water into and out of those systems, but I don't think it would necessarily have an effect on terrestrial fauna. I don't have too many concerns about that.
Mm-hmm. You don't think they notice there's things of different?
I don't think so. I mean, I monitored post-construction at Messenger's pump station for the Hatter TLM project, and the region parrots continued nesting at that location. And there's a big pump set right next to their nest sites, and they continue to nest there with the same frequency as prior to construction. Yep.
Yeah. In regards to the Warkle, I think there'll be a lot of investigation of what happened at the Warkle and whether the Kundruk Paracuda had anything to do with the veracity of that flood that went down the Warkle. So what about, next question is, what effect does the blue-green algae have on fauna? And from your experience and in regards to these projects, do you think that there's a risk from blue-green algae?
I don't understand the question. I mean, there's the blue-green algae. How has that got any relationship to the mean, it can occur anywhere under the right conditions. Yeah, I can't really comment on that really in relation to fauna.
So it doesn't have any effect on fauna?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a water quality expert. That's not my area of expertise to comment on. I might have to leave that to something for Dr. Treadwell to explain or that sort of thing. Okay, well, most fauna has to drink water, so I would have thought there was a link there, but okay, we'll move on. Well, that's debatable. Depends on what species you're talking about. Some will opportunistically drink, but there's lots of native fauna that don't need to drink water. So things like kangaroos, yeah, of course. Goats, pest fauna, yeah, sure, they do need to drink, but there's a lot of reptiles, woodland birds that don't necessarily need to drink water regularly. Yep. Thank you. You talked about in your surveying over many years, back to even 2013, your baseline surveying, that you have involved traditional owners. Are you aware of any traditional owners who are against these projects?
Dr. Kelly, I'm not sure that Mr. Holmes that's an appropriate question for Mr. Holmes. I'll ask you to move on. If you've got another question that relates to his areas of expertise, you're welcome to ask it.
I was just linking to his discussion about his involvement of traditional owners, but I'll move on. Next question is, in regards to the table you showed on long-term response of the...
So is that, was that
Victorian
slide 13?
Yeah, I think so. I see that you've got a column for do nothing, and then you've got columns for the different scenarios. Did you factor in any other alternatives, or was do nothing the only alternative?
In terms of alternative projects or that sort of thing, you mean, or?
Alternative alternative solutions to the lack of watering of the floodplain.
Member Kendall, I will interrupt there. We know Dr. Kelly's position about there should be water otherwise allocated for watering, and we've generally not trying to interrupt all along the way, but the position's clear. But unfortunately, for the terms of reference and for these projects, it's not a matter for this committee to look at alternatives. The role is to assess the impacts of these projects. And
thank you, Mr. Townsend.
And so we'll object to further questions, I think, because it just starts to get to a point where it takes time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. I don't mind Dr. Kelly asking questions about what the scope of what Mr. Holmes has considered. So in the context of that, Dr. Kelly, if you could continue.
Well, that's a different point. If it's what Mr. Holmes hasn't considered alternative, I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood that. Yeah, as we certainly don't object to questions about Mr. Holmes' evidence. My point is that it's not for the committee to look at other policy responses.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Townsend. And I think Dr. Kelly understands as well. So keeping the questions focused on what Mr. Holmes has considered. Thank you.
Yes, I just was asking him, was like in his table, he's got do nothing, and then he's got the scenarios. I wondered whether there was another column with other scenarios or possibilities, or just do nothing, because the question is for Mr. Holmes to answer.
Oh, look, for that particular column, I believe if we don't act at these sites, I think long term they're going to continue to decline. So that was my concern, and that's what that column's about. If we don't undertake these projects, the habitat quality and ultimately the fauna of these sites is going to continue to decline, in my view.
Yeah, and do you know who is asking to do nothing?
I don't know what you mean. We considered don't do the.
Dr. Kelly, I think I think I'll get you to move on, Mr. Holmes and Mr. Dr. Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Holmes, next question is about hollows, and with the tree death that has occurred across the riverine floodplain areas in the Mallee CMA, what is the value of a dead tree compared to a live tree? So which species are happy to live in a dead tree, or, you know, is a dead tree valuable? Can you...
Yeah, dead trees definitely valuable, yeah. I mean, reptiles, bats, there's a range of different species will use hollows and dead trees. But for example, a region parrot won't nest in a dead tree. They prefer living trees. So depends on the species you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. And I suppose where I was going with that one was with the dead trees that are going to be, or the trees that are going to be destroyed with these projects in the construction stage, and 31 trees not being removed. So some trees are going to be left. Was that because of your, was that because to help with fauna for habitat?
I think that's, look, I won't comment in detail on that. That's something for Ms. Jelly, but that's more around the tree protection zones and the native veg framework. So trees are considered as lost, but in actual fact, they might survive depending on, yeah, look, that's outside my area of expertise. I'm not going to comment in detail. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's a native veg thing. It's a native veg thing and an arborist assessment of whether the trees are likely to survive or not.
Yeah, no, sorry, you're not, I'll clarify what I meant. Just say there's going to be, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but 100 trees cut down for these projects. Well, some are going to be taken away, but there's going to be some left for woody debris for habitat.
Okay, yep.
And the question is about illegal firewood collection, and is there a chance that without dealing with illegal firewood collection, that woody debris is not going to be there for threatened species, or for?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can comment on illegal firewood removal and whether that's likely to happen or not.
Yeah. Do you see that?
I would assume that if it's left in situ after the clearing, it'll remain in situ. I can't comment on whether it gets removed or otherwise. It's not for me to comment on. I don't know.
It's not a threatening thing in these areas? I'll move on.
Maybe it occurs. I don't know. Yeah, I can't comment on that.
Okay, I thought, yep. With Regent Parrot, did you investigate or research or do any field work on nesting sites in the project areas and then the adjacent non-project areas?
Yeah, I did mention early on that I have done nest surveys over in New South Wales, opposite on the other side of the bank. So yeah, I do have a good understanding of nesting habitat in the Belser Younger area.
Yeah, is that Manny State Forest?
Yeah. I think that would be Peacock Creek Flora and Fauna Reserve. Yeah. But I've also undertaken a range of surveys at Hatter as well, so I've got a good understanding where they're nesting at Hatter.
Yeah, and are they coming further south or east?
How do you mean, like flying in that direction or nesting in that direction, or? Yeah.
Living, like, is their extent moving, their range?
I don't think their range is changing. There could be more numbers, but I don't have evidence to support that. There were some surveys done by Parks Victoria a couple of years ago that had some pretty high numbers in Annuello, which is not too far from Belser. But
what about Boundary Bend?
I know they occur there. I'm not sure I can comment too much on the population there. I've observed them there.
So your studies in non-project areas, is that in your report?
Dr. Kelly, can I just ask, apologies, Mr. Hunt. Dr. Kelly, could I just get you to explain your line of questioning?
I suppose I'm asking to tease out impacts of these projects on the non-project areas.
Okay, I'll ask Mr. Holmes to answer that.
Data about the non-project areas adjacent to the projects.
To the extent that you can, Mr. Holmes, you're welcome to respond.
We've certainly considered that, yeah. So at Belsa, yeah, obviously we'll consider other nearby colonies. I mean, it's effectively the same colony, really. It's just the river in between. But we've definitely considered. We don't just ignore that. I've surveyed the area. I'm not going to ignore the nearby colony, or part of the same colony. So
yeah,
I haven't ignored that. No,
I don't think the birds know about the border, do they?
No, they just use the habitat area.
Yeah. Next question. Have there been any species go extinct in the study area?
In terms of in recent times, I mean, historically, yeah, there's a whole suite of native mammals, critical weight mammals, they call them, that have gone extinct in the past, yeah, for sure, since European settlement.
What's that called? Critical what?
Critical weight mammals, yeah. So mammals between, I think it's like 300 grams in a kilo or 1.2 kilos. They're sort of bettongs, western quolls, western barred bandicoots. They're all gone from those areas that would have been there before.
Mm-hmm. What about the large-footed myotis?
The bat. How do you want me to comment on the bat?
What's its conservation status?
Look, I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know whether it's actually even threatened in Victoria. I'd have to confirm that. But it was thought to be present in northwest Victoria, but it's been absent for quite some time.
It was listed as rare in '93, but I haven't got anything more. Yep.
We have done surveys hoping to record it again, but we haven't had any success. But yeah, I would have thought introduction of environmental water might support potential recolonisation of that bat.
And the Plaucident planigale?
Giles planigale, yeah, that's known from Lindsay, Wapolla, so the EES West sites. Yeah, not known from Belsa or Hatter. We've looked for them and haven't found them.
Yep. Eastern water skink?
They occur. Yeah, they're relatively common throughout sort of northwest Victoria. They're around. Yep. Live on the riverbanks, that sort of thing.
Yep. And what about red-naped snake?
The Fiorina, yeah, they occur sort of more in the EES West sites, not so much these sites. Pretty limited distribution, Victoria.
Yep. And with the carpet python, it was vulnerable back in '93. What's its status now?
It's endangered now. Very, very, very cryptic animal. So could be very hard to detect. Very difficult to detect if it is present. We did pick up a few records at a few of the sites during the surveys, which was good. They're very difficult to detect. Sort of relatively small population in Victoria. Main threats being predation by pest animals like cats and foxes, and that sort of thing seems to be the main impact on that species. And a lack of native prey. It's as I mentioned before, those critical weight mammals that disappeared. So some do depend on rabbits for food.
Yep. And do you think the Mallee CMA area for these projects is well studied or understudied in regards to the carpet python?
Oh, look, to be honest with you, a carpet python, if you want to do a carpet python survey, it's they're just opportunistically found. You could go and target that species as much as you like and you might come up with a big zero. They're very difficult to survey for. So we largely have to rely on anecdotal reports or people putting information into the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas for that species. Very seldom recorded.
Yeah.
But we know they're there. We assume they're there. So
yeah, with these projects, do you think they're going to be happier in the project areas or the non-project areas?
How do you mean, within the actual watered areas or external to the watered areas?
Well, if one had to choose to live in, say, Belsa or to live in
Dr. Kelly, I'm just not confident that the line of questionings of assistance to the committee with consideration of the matters before us. Very interesting to hear Mr. Holmes's responses and to understand more about the individual species, but I'll ask you to move on and to keep your questions targeted if that's okay. I understand it's a great opportunity to hear from Mr. Holmes, but I'll ask you to move on.
Yes, I think I'm excited to talk to Mr. Holmes because of COVID, there was no public meetings. So we haven't had that interaction that without COVID and floods, we might have had. It's just one of those side effects of what the last few years have been. So excuse my indulgence there, but I think getting down to the really detail about these species is fundamental to this hearing. The issue of connectivity, Mr. Holmes, we've brought up in our submission. Can you, which species do you think might be affected if there's less connectivity?
Look, I don't believe there will be any loss of connectivity. These areas are largely intact. The project footprints are quite localised within the landscape. I don't believe we're going to lose any connectivity through those habitats.
I'll just clarify. The project areas are going to have positive responses, according to all the research there. But the non-project areas will continue to decline. So that's what I'm alluding to, is where the connectivity will be interrupted. If we have continuing decline in the non-project areas, that will have an effect on species.
Oh, look, I can loosely comment on that, but from local knowledge, I know the Mallee CMA have their environmental water management plans. They do target those other lower priority sites, I guess. So they do receive water via other means, but that's about all I can comment on that.
Yeah. And do you have any comment on the term engineering arrogance?
I'm happy for you to move on.
I don't know what you want me to say about that.
Last question. In your opinion, you've said you live in Mildura, so you've obviously, I haven't actually read all about your background, but I presume you've worked in these areas a lot over the years.
Correct.
Yeah. In the last few years, do you think there's been a go slow by the Mallee CMA and other authorities to do with the river to make these floodplain areas look worse or seem like they're worse off as a way to have more need for these projects?
I don't know how you can make a comment on that. How would you? Yeah,
I'm happy
I don't know how to respond to that.
I think we'll finish it there. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. That was your last question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Dr. Kelly.
So we have questions from the committee. I anticipate we should be able to move through them relatively quickly. So we'll continue now. We're scheduled to have a break at 11:30. So I'll hand to Member Bell to start with questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Just following up on one of the questions you were just asked about the cultural significance of animals, and you mentioned that you're aware of totem species. Is it your evidence that you looked for animals or species of interest for traditional owners, and so that information is there should that need to be used?
Oh, look, I wouldn't necessarily say I look specifically for those totem species, but yeah, obviously we record whatever we see. It's information that they can obtain and look at if they would like to.
Thank you. And so if there was, I guess, a need or a desire for a culturally attuned appraisal of risks to animal species, do you think that information from your reports could be used to feed into that process?
There's a lot of detail and information there. I would have thought so. Yeah, there's lots of information available. There's a good summation of what's known about the fauna in each of the sites. Information on the ecology. It's the reports certainly summarise all that information. So,
thank you. Moving on to the butterfly. So I just wanted to clarify the situation. Is it your evidence that the butterflies already recolonised the area once already after the 1975 floods?
I believe so, yes. Well, that would be my belief. There's not really any previous assessments prior to that to suggest that it was there before, then it was flooded and then it recolonised. It appears that that's happened, but we don't have any data necessarily. There's no survey data pre-1975 to say that they were there before.
Thank you. And so excluding the current flood, where they currently are hasn't been flooded since 1975?
No, it hasn't, but it should have.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, that'll just cut out a couple of questions. So if we are to assume that they can recolonise, do you think that there might be natural temperature or atmospheric cues for the ants to relocate prior to a natural flooding that wouldn't occur in a managed situation?
Look, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know that.
That's okay. Moving on.
I'm not really an insect specialist, so I can't really comment specifically on that sort of thing. But
that's okay. At your expert witness statement, could you please take me through paragraphs 5.14 and 5.15 in relation to the ant?
5.14.
Yeah. Particularly in relation to the requested buffer from DELP. I'm just trying to understand.
Oh, okay. Yes. So you want to know about that buffer?
Yeah,
okay.
Just trying to understand what the context, just a little bit more context about what you've said there in 5.14.
Okay. So what we did is, we obviously looked for the ants within the MIA and also outside the MIA, but we didn't simply, so basically what we assumed to be the MIA, or the area of impact from the water, was the mapped maximum inundation area plus 100 metre buffer. And the reason why we did that is because it's the belief that the ant nests can be up to 100 metres across. So we're basically allowing for ant nests that extend beyond that maximum inundation area. So that's what that 100 metre buffer means, or that's why it was applied.
Okay, thank you. And 5.15?
Okay, yeah, so this is about the tree. As I mentioned before, so just reading this quickly now. Yeah, so as I noted before, so Camponotus terebrans and I guess ultimately the Agorus butterfly is only known to use oviposition sites on living trees. There's never been an oviposition site found on a dead tree. So we were suggesting that potentially there could be benefits from maintaining the health of the black box.
And is it your evidence, or it might be going out of your expertise, that the black box in that area would continue to decline in absence of flooding?
Well, you would assume it would.
Thank you. I just wanted to go to submission 6, and I can share this if you like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. Hopefully my sharing skills are improving, but we've got that.
Yep, I can see that.
So just going to the dot points there, this is submission 6. I won't scroll up because I might lose it. So just looking at those dot points, in your opinion, do the recent surveys that you've undertaken satisfactorily address the first 2 recommendations in that submission?
So all site data points collated, yes, that's been done. Based on previous service with Fabian Douglas and Fiona, yes, that's been collated. So all that information has been pulled together. Extensive surveys undertaken to improve the butterfly in relation to proposed floodplain adjacent service. Yeah, look, that's been done. I mean, extensive surveys have been done. The entire floodplain area hasn't been completely surveyed, but a reasonable survey effort's been undertaken.
Okay, and then to the third dot point, can you comment on the need to survey for the leaf hopper?
Look, I don't really know that. I don't understand that relationship myself. I've read about it, but I don't know that in detail.
That's okay. And in relation to the 4th dot point, understand that you're looking for habitat mapping, which you showed in your slide pack, but it also could be in relation to the presence as opposed to potential habitat mapping. Just
yeah, but I think that one looks at, based on the above, the spatial distribution should be estimated more precisely. Area of occupation is better understood in relation to the project area. Yeah, I mean, that could be taken to be, area of occupation could be much broader than Hatter North. We've only, that habitat, that predicted model is only for that Hatter North area. It's not the broader distribution of the butterfly.
Oh, I understand.
So if you looked at the broader area of occupancy of that butterfly, it would extend into other states if you look at it in detail. So that model could be extended, that model, but you would need data from other areas to input into it.
Am I to understand that that's the limit for Victoria though?
No, it's not. So they're known from Pink Lakes as well, but that population hasn't been looked at recently to my knowledge. They were also originally found at the Mildura Cemetery, but that population was lost some time ago, yeah.
So would you agree with submissions that the Hatter Lakes is the most significant population for Victoria?
For what we understand currently, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. So in circumstances where there has been a flooding and specific concern has been raised regarding the impacts of flood duration, do you think it's warranted to require post-inundation surveys from this flood? And if found to survive, as in if the butterfly survives what's out there now, to limit the duration of any managed floods to a period of less than the current inundation?
Let me think about that for a minute. So what are you saying? Like so create a flood duration less than what's currently occurring on site naturally?
Yeah, if concerns have been raised that firstly, we don't know if they're going to survive.
Well, they won't survive. I'll tell you now, they won't survive.
Or recolonise.
It's more about recolonisation, yeah.
Yeah. So specific submissions have been made that the ability to recolonise might be dependent on the duration of inundation. So I think the rationale is that the ants might be able to dig deeper, but don't quote me. So if we get a good outcome after this flood, would it be conservative to limit any managed inundation to have a less duration than this flood?
I would have thought you'd try to mimic natural conditions, really, because that's very species specific. We're not considering anything else across the floodplain, the needs of other species. It's just very focused on one species. But it's also unknown, so we need to go and have a look after the current flood and see what's happening, what response we get.
So do you think, you mentioned in answer to a question from Mr. Townsend yesterday that your recommendations for monitoring were for research purposes only. Is it still your opinion that the significance of the species or causal connection from the project is such that such surveying should only be for research purposes?
I think so. It just helps us understand that recolonisation process. Just gives us more information, I think. But we can't lose sight of the fact these areas flood. It's a natural floodplain. They should be allowed to flood at a similar frequency as has occurred naturally. You know, we've got to think outside a couple of specific species and think more broadly. You know, we know the species occurs outside the inundation area. They're not solely dependent on the floodplain.
In the context that we've heard submissions that the flood on the private property in question can be managed, I guess I'm looking to, should a management response be limiting inundation just on that land until further information is known and further certainty is known about species?
Oh, look, I can't comment on what the private landholders do or don't do. It's purely up to them whether they manage the inundation in there or not, or refuse water in there. I don't know what the processes are there, but
okay. So in terms of in terms of the impact of inundation from the project, it is your evidence that that's a natural process that should happen anyway, and if there are implications for the ant. Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's
just wanted to be.
It's a natural process. Nature prevailed this time around. It'll happen again. That's the natural processes of that floodplain.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess there could be an argument that the species is quite limited, even though it's a bit broader than where you found it. I understand that if it's found a niche to hold on to, and submissions are saying the alternate is extinction, should that niche be protected?
I don't think that's the case. Yeah.
Okay.
But knowledge is only limited by the survey effort implemented. So if you do broader surveys, you know, it could be found even further afield than what we found it. So that's just current knowledge.
Okay. And so that goes neatly into just specifically addressing the submission that your risk assessment underrates the risk. Could you just explain, just go through your response to that submission in particular?
Yeah, well, again, the reason we've rated it that way is because, I mean, effectively, natural flooding is going to get into that area anyway. So it's not due to the project that part of that proportion of the population is going to be impacted. I mean, from what I can gather, it really should have been wet maybe 4 times in the last 50 years, that floodplain. So it's a natural process that's occurring. The proposed frequency of inundation approximately meets what would happen naturally anyway. So, and if you had a natural flood, you wouldn't inundate it. You wouldn't put a managed flow in there if you'd had a natural flood. You take that into account. So
And specifically your estimate that the population, that it's only less than 1% of the population?
I can't remember my exact numbers. What did I say there?
It just comes from your consequence rating. So
yeah, I mean, look, I'd have to revisit that again after this natural flow event, to be honest. I mean, we've been pretty conservative, but humans have very short memories, and as we saw the flood pass through the region again, people were like, oh yeah, it does flood to that sort of height.
Oh,
and up to 800 millimeters more than that, actually, but anyway.
Thank you. And Dr. Murdoch notes that the second most common species for the oviposition sites is the hotbush, excuse me, sorry, which will die a week after inundation.
Yes.
Could you just comment on that, if the long-term improvement of the health to the black box is adequate to offset that?
Yeah, hotbush colonises pretty quickly. It's a colonising plant. It's actually listed as a woody weed in New South Wales. So they tend to colonise disturbed areas. Hatter in the past had quite a history of grazing by both kangaroos and stock. So hotbush is a good colonising plant. So I think that'll colonise pretty quickly again in those areas in between flooding. So yes, the hotbush will die off initially, but it'll grow back pretty quickly.
Thank you. Sorry, just going back to the ability to restrict inundation on private property, are you aware, and you might not be aware, if there's any further infrastructure required to achieve that?
I don't know about the actual infrastructure, whether there is or not.
That's okay. I'm sure the proponent will address us on that. Moving on to hollow replacement, that you've asked some questions about. Can you tell me what the proposed fate of felled trees and branches is? Is there a need or potential for a tree and timber reuse and repurposing plan?
Look, we typically leave some of the, for Hatter TLM, for example, we left a lot of the large trees in situ on the ground in those locations. So that's typically what we try to do as much as possible. So basically contribute to the coarse woody debris or large hollow logs present on site.
Do you think it would be of benefit to address that in the EDS?
I'll just have to check that and see the wording around what we've said with that, actually. Do you mind if I double check that?
Yeah, that's fine.
In terms of what we've addressed there? Yeah.
I couldn't understand the process from the EDS, but I may have missed something.
Okay. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'll double check that and get back, take that on notice. Would that be okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. And just to summarise, I guess, your previous evidence that you've given in response to other questions about this, you're not fundamentally opposed to a hollow replacement plan implemented appropriately, but it is your evidence that it's not required to mitigate a significant impact from the project removing those.
Correct. Yeah, correct. I'm not opposed to it as long as it's done properly, as I've outlined before. But I don't necessarily believe it's necessary yet.
Due to the insignificance of the impact in the context of the
broader habitats at the site.
Thanks.
Yeah, correct.
And just in your expert witness statement at 5.19, you could just go to that paragraph.
Yep.
If you could, yeah, just, I think it's in the context of our further discussions, but just that second sentence.
However, it is true that some individuals or some systems may adopt artificial hollows and benefit from such a plan. Yeah, and I'm saying a methodical and scientific hollow replacement plan could be beneficial. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're still saying they're in relation to some species benefiting. It's still not necessary to mitigate a significant impact to those species.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. They could benefit, but I mean, you put up artificial hollows, you end up with bees in them and feral species and all sorts of things. So it could benefit, but you'd need to test that. You need to monitor that.
And in the context, it's not necessarily warranted.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thanks, Member Bell.
Thank you, Member Bell. Dr. Brisker also has a few questions for you, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Holmes.
Hi, Dr. Brisker.
Yeah, my first question relates to your slide number 13. And that's one we've looked at a couple of times this morning already, showing predicted long-term responses.
Yep.
And my first question about that is, are the predicted responses, are they average, best case or worst case responses or outcomes?
Sorry, so average best case or average worst case?
Are they average? So is that on average what you'd expect, or does it account for, so if the project went exceedingly well, what would the absolute best case would be? And if everything that could go wrong did go wrong, what would the worst case be?
It'd definitely be that sort of average sort of situation. I mean, if you add water, you would still expect a strong positive response from water birds. If you added water to a wetland, you would expect a strong positive response from a frog, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're assuming that response. I'm not assuming that everything goes swimmingly well and only then we get a strong positive response.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what the risks to the outcomes might be. So what might be some of the risks to these outcomes, and what might be some of the poor outcomes that could occur?
Okay, just trying to understand.
So I guess for an example, so in terms of the aquatic ecology, some of the risks were things like carp invasion, salinity, low dissolved oxygen, black water and so forth for fish kills, and just wondering whether there's any things within the terrestrial fauna that might sort of similarly be things that could eventuate. And I guess my question following on from there are also interactions between things that those risks to the aquatic ecology that might have flow-on effects. So if there's an explosion of carp, would they potentially compromise any growling grass frog population recovery by the carp eating the tadpoles, for example?
Yeah, look, it is possible. I think, look, we did consider that, but I mean, what's the alternative for the growling grass frog? You'd rather provide habitat and assume that they'll do well, which they tend to when you do provide water. But yeah, there is potential for carp to predate tadpoles and things like that. So I guess your hope would be that aquatic vegetation was growing in those systems on year-on-year re-wetting of those sites. You'd see some good positive responses from aquatic vegetation that would provide some cover for things like growling grass frogs and their tadpoles as well. So there's potential for that, yeah.
Yeah, so with any of those groups, is there a potential, you've got all the outcomes there as being neutral at worst and positive to very positive. There are any risks for the current trajectory to decline for any species, even with the project?
To continue to decline due to the project?
Or with the project rather than due to the project or despite the project?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah.
No, there's nothing that jumps out. It's the assumption is that it will support the habitat for the species and in turn will provide positive outcomes for the species.
Mm-hmm. With the current trajectory of decline, some of them, I think the logic is fairly obvious and a couple of them are less clear to me, and I'm just hoping for an explanation. The ones that are less clear, I guess, are the ones that particularly as shown as responding in neutral, potentially responding only neutrally to the project. So I'm looking at, in particular, terrestrial mammals and bats as, I guess, groups that I'm trying to understand why the current trajectory of decline should occur if nothing is done.
Which one are you talking about? Oh, the terrestrial mammals.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I think for some of those, or for bats in particular, because they're so wide ranging, it depends on, you know, what habitats they're using as to whether it would, if they're using, you know, black box and red gum habitat, for example, you'd expect a positive response. But some of the species, yeah, it could be more of a neutral response. And some of that's related to the fact that they're not well studied. So we're making some assumptions about that response to environmental water.
So is it possible for some of the various groups with the default trajectory that it's possible the trajectory may be current trajectory of decline if there is a decline, or a neutral trajectory rather than just a trajectory of decline? So there's some overlap between what might occur with a project as opposed to what might occur if there is no project, given that not all species will necessarily respond in the same sort of straightforward way. For example, things that are more aquatic would, or more riparian would respond more strongly. I would have expected.
That's right. Some of those species would, I mean, obviously, you know, water birds and frogs, as I mentioned before, you're going to get a very strong response. Some of the others, it's less clear, but you would assume, you know, with the maintenance of habitat, that would be positive. But for some species, there's not been a huge amount of data on response to environmental water. So that's where we're a little bit more cautious in terms of our predictions. But that's only a couple of fauna groups, really, when you look at it.
So maybe for those groups of that table is giving, I guess, a greater impression of the impact than might be the case. There might be a bit more overlap than in terms of neutral response to the default.
I don't think it's going to be negative. I don't think the project's going to produce a negative response. Yeah, it's either neutral or positive. It's it's on the borderline of that, I guess.
And in terms of the risks to the outcomes, and I'm interested in these, not in terms of necessarily the project will have negative responses, but how things that need to be picked up in the EDS to be managed. So first of all, with the risks that have been highlighted through the aquatic assessment, so things like carp, possibly salinity, changes to salinity, possibly the deoxygenation of water, fish kills and so forth. Are there any implications of those for the terrestrial fauna that would be relevant and that might need to be looked out for?
Oh, we've certainly taken into consideration. I mean, obviously, you know, responses. Mr. Hoxley would have outlined around groundwater. We definitely considered impacts on vegetation. So we've used that as without actually having data on exact responses from different fauna groups. We've used responses from vegetation and some of that sort of research, I guess, or information from Mr. Hoxley's report, and also Ms. Jelly's report as well. So we've definitely looked at risks to vegetation to inform the fauna risks.
Yeah, and have you also looked at Mr. Marsden's report and Dr. Treadwell's report in terms of Mr. Marsden in terms of, I guess, some issues associated with aquatic ecology, and then Dr. Treadwell's report in terms of some water quality issues?
Yeah, definitely considered. We've looked at all reports. A lot of the work's been done with groups of people in workshops and different things like that. So we've definitely looked at other considerations as well to inform our risk assessment.
And so based on that, do you feel satisfied that in your assessment you've covered off on those issues, and if the EDSs have satisfactorily covered off on any issues that might pose a material risk to the terrestrial fauna?
Yeah, I'm satisfied. I've been involved in all discussions and EDS development in relation to terrestrial fauna.
Yep. Move on now to these assessment of key effects and the residual risk ratings, which are on slides 14 and 15 of your presentation. So the next page, just scrolling down through there. And I'm particularly interested because I've had a fair bit of discussion about construction already. So I wanted to focus really on operational risks, and note for BELSA, you're suggesting the risks to native species and threatened ecological communities and habitat are low, but there's a medium risk for threatened species. I was hoping you could elaborate on that and what might be done, whether anything could be further done to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, look, I haven't got my actual ratings in front of me here. I might have to go back and have a look at how we arrived at those outcomes again. But they are quite conservative. That medium risk is quite conservative. I know that for a fact. But I might just need to go back and have a look at that in a bit more detail. And
that would be helpful.
Can I give you a response on notice? Would that be okay? That
would be fine. And the same question also then applies to hatter, where you have two medium risks, one for native species, one for threatened species, again, to understand what that entails. Yep. There's an opportunity to further mitigate.
Yeah, I can provide more detail on those, why those ratings were given.
Yeah, that's good. That would be very helpful. I'll move across to your expert witness statement. He made a comment on paragraph 5.6 that it's your belief that the VMFRP projects are required. And I just wanted to unpack that comment slightly.
Sorry, what was that paragraph again?
Paragraph 5.6. So you say, having lived and worked within the North
Oh, okay, in the first section there. Yep, gotcha.
And having witnessed the landscape under severe drought conditions, it is my belief that the projects are required. I want to unpack that and just clarify what aspects of the projects are required. So I guess the projects bring water to the landscape, and they also do it in a certain particular way. And so I just wanted to clarify whether it's your evidence that the projects in their totality, in terms of all the various aspects of them, including the infrastructure, whatever, are required, or whether from the viewpoint of the terrestrial fauna, whether the presence of water in the landscape is really the main thing that's required. That's the benefit of the project rather than the projects per se.
Yeah, okay.
Or whether there's, or I guess to put another way, to see whether... So you're saying, so what I've heard from your evidence so far is that you're saying that the presence of the water is a critical thing for the terrestrial fauna.
Exactly, yes.
And I'm trying to unpick whether there's any other elements of the projects other than the presence of water that is absolutely critical. So is there something about the ability to manage it in a certain way? Is there something about particular bits of infrastructure, any other understanding of the project that has certain, is there anything else to it other than just presence of water?
Oh, look, it's clearly presence of water. I mean, I'd love the system to flood with the regularity that would have pre-river regulation. How you achieve that without the necessary infrastructure, I'm not aware of how you would achieve that and deliver the water into those areas without that. Having been involved with these types of projects for more or less for 17 years I've been at GHD, I don't know of any other way to deliver water other than the way it's been done. Hence my belief that the projects are necessary. I've seen these sites in the worst condition possible, and I've obviously seen over the last few years things have obviously improved a bit, but will no doubt go back to dry again at some stage. So how do we mitigate that into the future without these projects? Hence my belief.
Understand that. Now I note from your expert witness statement and also from the submission that Fabian Douglas was involved in your investigation. He was also a submitter.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify what his role was in your study, and then I guess whether you have any comments on his role and whether you have any comments on his submission. Specific comments on his submission.
So we obviously consulted with him because of his experience with the butterfly, with the Mildura butterfly. So he didn't take part in any actual on-ground surveys, but he did review our methods prior to going out into the field, and he also reviewed some of our reports as well. So we just thought it was important to consult with him and just get his opinion on different things, because he has such a detailed understanding of the butterfly and its requirements and its ecology. Do I have any comments on his submission? There wasn't any specific comments, I don't think, that I pulled out from what he suggested.
So I understand there are differences of opinion, but so he's not like someone who's been working with you and then has sort of broken out and made a submission. It's more like someone who called in an external expert to review.
Yeah, he's interested in the butterfly, so he's made a submission based on that. He had concerns for the butterfly. There's nothing in his submission that sort of stood out to me that it was just stating what we already knew.
Yeah. Okay, moving down, just still on the butterfly. In your expert witness statement, you talk about the monitoring requirements for a gyrus, and I just noticed we don't have yet a day one version of the environmental management framework. So I just wanted to see, I guess, whether those monitoring requirements you outline, are already picked up adequately in the exhibited document, or I guess what the process will be for getting those into the day one version, or the sort of end of hearing version. I guess what your involvement will be in ensuring that whatever turns up in there is consistent with what you've recommended.
Oh, you mean the MER document prepared by RI? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, it'll be, so in the EES, there's a section which is environmental management framework, which then uses to frame what happens afterwards in the CMP and IMP, and where the environmental delivery standards are. And so far, we've got the day one version of the delivery standards, but we don't have the day one version, or a sort of an updated version subsequent to the exhibited version of the rest of it. So given that those recommendations, I think, go beyond the EDS, I just wanted to understand the process by which your recommendations would go into there, and then we'd understand that you've reviewed and have verified or commented on what lands.
Perhaps I can answer that one for you, Dr. Briscoe, and I understand the question. That is our intention. So the notion of the day one is, in some respects, doesn't assume all the evidence and the outcomes, and also is neutral, as you know, based on some arguments, for argument's sake, on the offsets where we leave it, and we'll be certainly not putting that case. So that our intention, and as in previous hearings, is with our day two, we pick up matters we've heard in evidence, and we would undertake to you, we've checked them with that particular individual as well. So in our day two version, we'll satisfy you, or try to, that where something's come out of Mr. Holmes's recommendations, that we're able to also tell you that we've drafted it with Mr. Holmes's input. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Does that assist? Thanks, madam. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, I guess, understand the process. And
yeah, I understand. It's
not end up in a situation where the committee ends up having to piece through evidence and expert witness statements and reconcile them.
Yeah.
So
and we'll make sure that that's the case. And if there's any doubt from the committee, we would certainly invite you to press us for reminders on that, and we'll make sure that's the case. But I think that's the efficient process, is that we do the follow-up, the catch-ups, and then satisfy you that we've checked them out with the relevant experts. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you for that, Mr. Townsend. And thank you, Mr. Holmes. They're all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Briscoe.
Great, thank you, Dr. Briscoe. So there are no more questions from the committee. I'll hand you back to Mr. Townsend for any questions of re-examination. Thank you.
I just had one in two parts, Mr. Holmes, which arises in two different ways. But in a response to the questions about if a decision was made to manage private land for a particular species, being the butterfly, you answered it you're more interested in it being a floodplain, and bearing in mind there are other species and no doubt flora and fauna species that have to be part of that mix. But in a second question, when you're asked about the matters of the aquatic ecology, and there might be fish strands, for example, or after a deoxygenation event, there might be dead fish. In both contexts, the response you gave goes to it being a system of nature, not an individual species answer. And perhaps the first part of that was clear from your answer about why you're not enthused about protecting a patch of land for a single species for the butterfly. But can you answer on the second part, what are some of the consequences for fauna, for example, whether it's natural or because of a managed event, of a stranded fish or a fish die off when waters recede?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one because I think I mentioned that in my presentation yesterday. There are clear winners and losers at times during these situations. So you get a fish stranding, and you'll obviously get egrets and herons and things like that, and potentially lace monitors. There'd be lots of species that would potentially scavenge on those dead fish. So, or pick off the fish that are trapped on the edge of the wetland. So there's clearly some winners in that type of situation.
What's your expectation, if any, with the current flood, of your learnings post this flood as to whether that's occurring, how fauna is benefiting from the receding of the natural flood we're having now?
Oh, look, there's definitely a shift in waterbird gills as well. So as you get more exposed mud flats, you'll get some of the wading species will use those habitats. You could potentially get predators moving across some of those areas, picking off dead animals, that sort of thing, scavenging dead animals. So again, there's definitely different fauna groups that will respond in different ways to the water, whether it's at maximum sort of level, at peak level, or whether it's starting to decline, whether it's starting to recede. You'll get different mixes of fauna benefiting from the various levels of inundation, various extents.
So I linked those two under that proposition I first advanced around looking at it as a system, not as a species-specific assessment. Can you expand on, are there any other examples, or using those, on why you, in a number of your answers, seem to prefer looking at it the system rather than as a species?
Yeah, well, I think from a fauna perspective, depending on the various water regimes that have delivered, I think that's what I was saying before. There's different species will benefit depending on what's delivered, but you have to look at it as an entire system. So we have to look at the broader benefits to the floodplain habitats as well. So whether it's black box or other woodland habitats. So there's broader benefits across, but you have to look at the entire suite of species. Which, when we do that, when we did our surveys, we obviously we didn't just look at one species or one particular animal, but we looked at that broader suite of different species. So,
are there any practical examples? Suppose, and it is assuming the private landowner with the butterfly, and even ignoring the current flood for this question, assume it was retained at the choice of a landowner for the protection of a particular species and at the expense of inundation. What are some of the fauna species or any other ecological indicators you'd like to go to that might be detrimented by that decision?
Yeah, well, I suppose if I talk specifically about that area, you were asking me to ignore the current flood, but I did point out there's a couple of birds recorded recently that haven't been seen from the area for a long time. So diamond dove, that's actually threatened in Victoria, that was recorded in Hatter North recently, and also plumed whistling duck. So that was also recorded. That's not a commonly recorded species in Victoria. But I think if water didn't get into that system, the fringing vegetation, which provides habitat for reptiles, bats, woodland birds, that potentially could suffer long term if that water doesn't get into that system. So you're excluding water from an area for one specific species, but you're allowing habitat decline for a whole suite of different species. So I think that's the key to the whole thing, really. And you're also preventing opportunistic habitat for other species that might be able to come and utilise that area when it's wet. So there's those broader benefits that you're going to get that you won't realise by focusing on one particular species.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Member Kendall. That's the questions for Mr. Holmes, if he may be excused.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, Member Campbell.
I should say, Mr. Holmes, before you do go off screen, just so I'm clear for the committee, I did make a note of something you gave an answer that you'd like to take on notice. Can I just clarify that we're clear when you go, because we'll need you to get that answer back through us. I made a note, so I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I had one about the risk assessment. So I was just going to look at those risk ratings and get back to the committee on that.
So, Mr. Townsend, if it helps, it's slides 14 and 15 in the presentation.
Thanks very much, Dr. Brisger. Yes, and on the wording, well, actually, can I just be clear? There was certainly one, we've got a note here about checking the wording in the EDS and or the EMF about
coarse-woody debris.
The clarity around reuse of timbers and the like of trees. But then you've got Dr. Brisger's question that was going to some clarification around those slides. Perhaps if we leave it there, and I'll see, Dr. Brisger, if I don't get the right answer, if we haven't understood it, if it's all right, if I can come back to you at some point.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks very much.
Great,
thanks, Member Kendall.
Thank you. So just before we break, I'll remind people Dr. Brisger will be finishing now for the day. So we'll be sitting with us again next week. And we'll be joined by Member Ham after the break. We'll break now for just under 15 minutes so we don't lose too much time this morning and try to get through the evidence. So we'll see everybody back at 11:55. Member Bell has her hand up.
I'm sorry, there was one other question on notice from Environment Victoria's questioning. Is that okay, Chair?
Thank you. I'm assuming that Mr. Townsend has got that on his list, but if you need any clarification, you're welcome to ask Mr. Townsend.
Yeah, I'm happy if you, I don't mind the prompt, Member Bell. If you, do you remember which one it was? I probably do have a note, but.
So the question was around the benefits in chapters 5 and 6, and I was still unclear if they were the main report or the attachment 5 and 6.
Yeah, I think we learned
about the overall improvement in table 12 and how the number of habitat hectares was calculated.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think we established it was the attachment, not the EES chapters.
Okay.
You're right. But you're right. But on the second part, we'll look, I don't know the answer. We will look at how that was calculated. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right.
Great, thank you. Good to clarify that before we do break, but we'll see everybody back at 11:55. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to Member Ham, who has joined us, and you can see on the screen. I'll just make sure we have everyone else. I think we do. So, and I'm not sure, Mr. Townsend, am I handing to you?
Over to me, Madam Chair.
Mr. Forrester, thank you, and welcome. Hello to you for this morning. We haven't spoken yet. So I'll hand directly to you, Mr. Forrester.
Thank you. And Mr. George is also in the gallery and should be able to come onto the screen, and I'll turn straight to him for his evidence.
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. George.
In the course of it, I'll refer to his statement, which is table document 79. His presentation is table document 132, and his evidence relates to Specialist Assessment J, which is the bushfire specialist assessment exhibited with the EES. You'll have noted that Mr. George does refer to the incorporated document, table document 94, and the EDS's table document 95, but my expectation is will be contained in those documents I've referred to, so we don't necessarily need them open in front of us. Now, Mr. George, thanks. I see you sharing the presentation, which I can see well. And just by way of introduction, can I confirm your name is Mick George?
Yes. Yep.
And correct. You're the Technical Director, Natural Resources and Bushfire at GHD?
That's correct.
And Mr. George, you've prepared a witness statement relevant to this inquiry dated the 15th of December 2022?
That's correct.
And the presentation you're now sharing, table document 132. Can I just confirm, as set out in your witness statement, you were the technical lead responsible for the preparation of Specialist Assessment J, bushfire?
That is correct.
Do you provide us with an adequate and accurate summary of your qualifications, experience and expertise in your witness statement? I think it appendixes A and B.
Yes, yep.
And do you have any corrections that you'd like to make to your statement or to your presentation?
No.
Do you adopt your statement, the specialist assessment and your presentation as your evidence before this inquiry?
Yes, I do.
All right, with that all done, can I ask you please to present to the inquiry the presentation you're now sharing and take it through the conclusions you've reached and opinions you've formed.
Excellent. Well,
thank you. And before you start, Mr. George, we're just, if I could get your audio sound up just a tad, it might be adjusting your headset will do the trick.
Yep, is that better?
I think that's fine, thank you.
Yep. No problems. Yeah, well, welcome everyone. So as we just touched through, I was the technical lead for the specialist report with the team that is outlined in the expert statement, so I won't go through that here. The works that we did relied heavily on consultation with a number of stakeholders and relevant emergency management personnel and the land managers to inform where we've got to. Works have undertaken, so we've taken that feedback through iterative changes through the drafting of the report and built those in along the way. I've also reviewed the public submissions as part of the process and provided a response to those where relevant in my expert statement and prepared the expert witness statement and this presentation. So going into the bushfire technical reporting, again, so I guess the starting premise was, and that is important to understand, is that there is existing bushfire in the landscape, and that has always been and will continue. So we weren't looking at whether fire will or will not be in the landscape, but what the changes are resulting from this. To assess that, we took a number of different lines of inquiry to determine what the impacts of any changes would be and how to quantify that. So we undertook extensive literature review to determine the ecological responses of the vegetation that was in the inundation areas to those flooding and environmental watering events. As touched on, agency engagement was extensive with Forest Fire Management, Victoria, Council, local councils, Parks Victoria, the CFA and others, including across the border in New South Wales with the Forestry New South Wales and RFS as well. We reviewed some photo points for evidence to assess the changes and what we could find, particularly from the Hatter Lakes area as a lived example, I guess. One of the team members, Steve Dahl, undertook site inspections pre and post watering events to understand those. We did some fairly detailed analysis and research into the fire history across the areas to get an understanding of that, including over an extensive period of time, the number of events, the extent of the events, and the size of each of the fires that have occurred. And then we did a more detailed fire history case study in the Hatter Lakes Icon site that looked at that. So, which has had environmental watering since 2012 and went back to the fire history since 1952 as a detailed case study. So this just shows looking at some sites there, and these are the reference to where we've drawn these figures from in the specialist assessment report. The areas in red that are shown on here are the fire history records that we've got, as opposed to the maximum inundation area. So what we've found for this site is, there's nothing has actually occurred within the maximum inundation area back to the 1950s. And there's quite a distance between those events. So there's been some small events here that you can just see with the labels and the numbers, and one larger event over an extended time period. The other figure that we're displaying here shows the vegetation types that we consider. So from a bushfire perspective, we talk about these classification types. So there's ones that are classified under the Australian Standard 3959, 2018 version, which is for bushfire construction in bushfire prone areas, and that classifies vegetation according to these groups that are post the slash, and we've mapped across with the vegetation groups, the water requirement groups to give the comparison so we can see what's happening there. So as you can see for the area, this is a zoomed in version of this, but it is largely that open woodland and shrubland through there with patches of red gum woodland that still falls in the woodland areas, and very small areas of open forest. That's important because fuel loading is associated with the different vegetation types. Forests typically have the highest fuel loads, followed by woodlands, down to shrublands, and then grasslands. Part of our assessment involved developing some credible fire scenarios. So that involved looking at the topography of the area, the vegetation type and linking to those fuel loads, the predominant fire weather as a driver for fire behaviour, and where that sits and where the area sits within the broader landscape. In accord with the assessment requirements, we did that at differing scales. So we had a landscape scale, which was 50 kilometres in this case, extending out, and then a combined sort of local neighbourhood and site scale. So it comes in at different levels. So from the 50 kilometre down to a kilometre, 100 odd metres, and then the site level, depending on what each asset was that we're assessing. So for this instance, we've found that there's two credible scenarios for bushfire based on that fire history, based on the fire weather analysis we've done and the vegetation types. So one is an ignition in a riparian area associated with a campfire escape or a barbecue escape, those sort of things that we drew that from fire history and ignition events. Under some northwesterly predominant winds driving in. And what we've found is that because of the fragmentation in the landscape due to the number of uses, that it's quite broken. You don't get those long fire runs to generate the excessive fire behaviour. So it's if one did occur, there's potentially a lot of time for, depending on where it starts and under what conditions, of course, because each fire is different, but there is a probability that there's adequate time for public and private landowners and visitors to evacuate from an escaping fire, and for the response agencies to respond and get onto the fire in terms of suppression before it became too large. The other one was through the sort of mallee and dryland agricultural vegetation areas. So a different vegetation type, which drives different behaviour. Under a southwesterly driving wind condition that also is experienced from this area. Typically, these start through lightning that we've found as a prominent cause of ignition. Can also be through operations in the dryland harvesting. So harvesting areas are headers, etc., starting a fire due to activities in there. Again, what we've found is that it's likely that it will be, you wouldn't generate those long fire runs because of the fragmentation in the landscape again, and that those irrigated areas particularly would limit the extent of any large landscape fires impacting on the area. Sorry, my dog's just barking at something. One of the other points that we looked at was the, don't know what he's going off at, but one of the other things we looked at was the photo points. So looking at what occurred in Hatter Lakes and from these watering events. Flowing through, you can see some different vegetation types where we've looked at in terms of the red gum with different types of understory. So a flood dependent, a flood tolerant understory. You've got the fringing red gum woodland and some black box woodland. So looking at these, you can see a flush of growth following inundation events. Typically in all the sites, you get that nice green growth that you'd expect. Drying off after a period of rain without rain or flood events. But as you can see, seasonal. This is 1 year to the next where there probably has been a little bit more rain in the landscape, and you get that natural flush growth. But there has been a decline or a decomposition since the 2011 through to 2016 when it gets quite dry. Then you get another watering event and another flush of growth in that instance. So for the red gum with the flood tolerant underspecies, you can see, yep, very, very low level of growth that comes through, decomposes quite quickly. Obviously a branch or something's fallen in the meantime on the photo point and then gone off, but no real lasting accumulation of growth there or change across that period. And again, when it comes to the post inundation, no real flush in following the 2017 event, but again, you can see any accumulation of finer fuels that have occurred isn't significant. It's just sort of continued on, and I think you can see that trend largely flows through all of the different photo points in the sites we've seen. So while there's an initial flush and some change, there's no longer term or significant changes in terms of a fuel loading perspective that we're looking at in terms of those ground fuels that are really important in terms of driving fire behaviour. So if we go a bit more to the Hatter Lake site in as a focus area, what we looked at here was where watering events have occurred since that 2012 period, and looking at any changes to the fire behaviour or fire frequency that may have occurred in that time over that 10-year period. In the lead up to it, I think it's important to know on this figure, it shows the millennium drought and very low level events. There has been flood since 2016 and some activities occurring there. There's been one fire since 2006, I think, occurring in 2006, a really small one in the middle here. That was a campfire that effectively escaped, but was put out very quickly. So the overall site, fire history going back to the 1950s, over 8,000 hectares has been burnt, but within the maximum inundation area of the project, 46 hectares in total. I think that's reflective of the mallee, other vegetation types where the larger fires may occur, with very small or limited fires occurring in along the floodplain areas.
Can I just confirm with you there, Mr. George, on the figure on the right-hand side of this slide, is the green outline the outline of the Hatter icon site that's referred to in the table on the left?
Yes, that's correct. Yep, there. Yep.
Thanks.
And then the blue, the maximum inundation. Yep. So just to go into a little bit more detail on the stakeholder engagement that we undertook as part of this as a key aspect of our investigation into the fire and any likely impacts or changes. So just set out there, that's the range of different people that we consulted with. Again, touched on earlier, but just to reinforce, it was quite extensive, and we talked with the land managers, we talked with council, emergency managers, and those involved in it across the area to get a good understanding of what practices were in place, their understanding of the risks associated with this, their experiences from particularly the Hatter Lakes, and any observations there that they'd seen in terms of fuel or fire behaviour in that time, to all inform our decisions and considerations on this. And a key finding or a key outcome from the Loddon Mallee bushfire management strategy of DELP from 2020 that really did support everything that we found through our detailed investigations was summed up in this this statement from that report. I won't read it all, but the key points are that there have been, while there's still fire in the landscape, and that always will be, those fires have been small and contained very quickly to less than 5 hectares in size in general. The features of the environment are important here. So there's a small influence of the topography. One of the driving factors of fire behaviour is the slope, and with slight slopes or low undulating land throughout here, you don't get that really increased or excessive fire behaviour like we see on the news when there's those big fire events and the long flames, etc. in there. There's a consistently high level of preparedness by response organisations and through Forest Fire Management Victoria and each of their own organisations. They have a strong cooperation and coordination between each other and are able to respond quickly, and that's reflected in these containing the fires to a small size. There's a number of different access tracks throughout there that allows for that rapid firefighter ingress. So for if whatever reason one is blocked or limited in its ability to pass, there's a range through there that allow that access in quite quickly. And that goes to the maintenance of the strategic fire access that's been identified by those organisations and maintained to that standard. And there's also the success of the fuel reduction activities that are outlined in the Joint Fuel Management Plan and implemented by the responsible agencies that are in there. And it also goes to, there's a responsibility on private landowners to manage bushfire risks on their land, and that is reflected in that low number of events and fire spreading. So all of that indicates from that statement, plus from our research, that the current measures are and have been effective in terms of bushfire management and suppression for this area. So based on the research and discussions and consultations, we identified a number of key risks for the maximum inundation area in the project as far as bushfire. So one is that a fire initiated on site, so through a project activity, spreads off site and impacts on human life, assets, property, community assets, or environmental values, or a combination of all of those. The other alternative, fire starts off the sites and spreads on and impacts to human life in terms of people involved in the management, operation, construction, people involved in these areas at the time, assets or environmental value, so potential damage to the assets that created as part of the project, or damage to the environment that we're trying to protect or enhance through the project. And there is some potential for an increased fine fuels within the project areas that may increase that bushfire intensity or fire spread, but we'll come more to that as we deal into it. So through all that, and I guess our starting hypothesis going into this was that we'd probably see some significant changes to the fuel loading and then therefore the potential fire behaviour in this. But through all of those investigation processes, that hypothesis was certainly tested and dispelled in a lot of ways as to what we've found and the evidence supported on that. So what we did find is that there is some expected short-term increases with the fuel, that flush of growth that occurs after a flooding event, particularly the grass fuels and those lower level fuels. While that does then potentially increase a shorter term, while those grasses are green, they're largely unavailable for consumption by fire. So the fuel moisture content's too high, or in grasses we talk about curing off, which makes them available. So immediately after they're green, unavailable. After a period of drying and a season or two later, they do cure off and they can become available. So there is potentially some increased risk there. What we did find though was the watering events did also assist in the decomposition of fine fuels that were already on the ground. So there's some offset in breaking them down there, plus also increasing the fuel moisture content of the heavier ground fuels that remained, which then makes them less available for consumption as well. So, if there's a heavy log on the ground that then comes flooded, it's obviously, if anyone's had a fire, it's harder to burn a wet bit of fuel, wet bit of timber than it is a dry bit of timber. So there is some balances there and offsets between those, as well as the flooding event sort of dispersing or relocating some of the finer fuels that may have been accumulating on the floor of the areas as well. Also on the flip side is that what we'd expect is that the environmental watering would improve the condition and the health of the woodlands that are in there, the fringing forests, and those wetland areas. That makes the trees more resilient to any bushfire events that did occur, and more likely to survive. It also contributes to that transition back into the more natural vegetation that would occur there, that tends to be that wetter type vegetation that is, again, it's more fire resistant or fire retardant due to the higher moisture contents of those species that are in there and occurring there. And again, so using the Hatter Lakes case study over that 10 years at the Icon site, through discussions with Forest Fire Management Victoria, they observed no increase in the overall fuel hazard, elevating the bushfire risk, and they did not need to amend or adapt or adjust their specific or targeted program for hazard monitoring or hazard reductions in that area over that 10-year period. So going to then the submissions that were put forward. So again, DELP Environment put forward a submission on this that we considered and looked at, and that their position was that the risks, any residual risks from, as far as a bushfire perspective, could be mitigated via a number of actions. So one was the ongoing preparedness and readiness and response activities during the operational phase of the project. A bushfire emergency response plan to be developed to their satisfaction prior to any works, and all strategic and operational road networks within Crown Land are built and maintained to their standards. In response to those, so we do have our EDS, there's a BF1 and a BF2 that we'll come to later. So they do specifically go to addressing that preparedness response activities in both the construction and operational phases. And specifically, so they do need to be developed in consultation with those land managers and emergency management and fire authorities as well. Areas outside the construction footprint and the maximum inundation won't be modified by the project activities. So existing access and track networks outside those areas will be unchanged and wouldn't need to be considered. And existing obligations and maintenance requirements outside that area will continue as is. Any upgraded tracks that are done as part of the project would include some vegetation clearance and potentially on a needs basis would include any turning circles or passing bays requirement to meet the requirements of there. So if then those roads were upgraded, they do provide an improved access as far as a fire response or fire management.
And Mr. George, for the purposes of your assessment, is it right that you proceeded on the basis of the various maintenance of existing tracks, upgrades to tracks, and in respect of Balsa-Yungera, the creation of new tracks, as is proposed in the EES?
That's correct.
Okay. And in the course of the engagement you undertook, which you've referred to in terms of dealings with agencies and authorities and so on, did you glean an understanding of the adequacy or appropriateness of the existing track network from a bushfire management and response perspective?
Yes, yep. There was certainly an indication through all our discussions that it was adequate and fit for purpose, and that there was nothing additional required to enhance the strategic network.
So that's the existing network that's in place, not that which would result after construction of the projects?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
And earlier in your slides, and here again on this slide, there's reference to the strategic fire access road network. I understand it to be the case that there is no strategic fire access road within either of these project areas. Is that right?
That's correct. That's our understanding.
Okay. You referred then to, in addressing the last point in respect of upgraded tracks, to the potential for that to deliver some sort of benefit in respect of the existing access track network and how that might be used in respect of bushfire. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, having regard to the fact that you've identified that you were advised that the existing track network was acceptable or adequate?
Yeah, so I guess any improvements or any work that's done on a road or track would, improve the potential access, I guess. So there's, for the construction works or others going in there, you're going to improve the surface of it just through the fact of doing any works. So that provides a complementary benefit where it's done. So it's not specifically required. All the evidence provided to us and advice given was that with the maintenance programs in place, the identification through works programs, etc., of what works need to be done, there isn't a requirement to upgrade this, but if works are being done, it would be beneficial, improving those access for any fire events or management that could be undertaken, and considerations of bushfire response requirements should be undertaken as part of that strategic assessment of or development of the networks.
So if I just pinch your screen sharing for the moment, I'm just going to share a page from the specialist assessment and ask you specifically about, this is table 3.6 and on screen is page 27. There's reference here to a remark or advice from the Parks Victoria Northern Region Fire and Emergency Program Coordinator and others, to the effect that inundation of tracks may cause access issues, and this would include after a session of water while tracks are still drying. So is that the sort of issue that you're identifying as responded to perhaps or improved on by reference to the potential upgrades?
Yeah, so I guess but part of it is, where they've been raised or, a change to an all-weather road that would assist as part of the construction or maintenance, then that's likely to improve. Where there's other roads that may be limited or impeded after a watering event, then as I touched on before, there are, and it's identified that there are a number of different access tracks in through the areas. So it's about working with and informing prior to a flooding event to say, well, if we're going to put it into these areas, centre track or something may be impacted on that. So let's look at what our alternate options are to be able to ensure we can get around to these areas in that time, rather than just putting the water in there and not considering those emergency requirements. So making sure that there still is accessibility through there, and that would be improved, not specifically for the bushfire purposes, but it would be improved as a result of the project activities.
All right, thanks. Look, I've scrolled down to page 31 where I think there's a similar comment, but I think you've adequately covered off on that. So I'll stop sharing and ask you to pull your presentation back up, please.
No worries.
The question of vegetation clearance is relevant on the last point on this slide. Perhaps I'll ask you to go to. And can I just seek to understand from you a bit better the consequences of or the relationship between the existing track network and how that might be maintained in terms of vegetation and the like, and what would be proposed by way of this project. So I understand from your specialist assessment that there is an existing program implemented by the various agencies in respect of the maintenance of tracks and in particular the maintenance of vegetation around the tracks. Could you explain how that's managed?
Yeah, so there's access requirements and considerations that are done. So as part of the joint fuel management plan and other land management activities and plans, those operational tracks are assessed and inspected on a a relatively frequent basis, and just depends on their importance and use, etc. But they're checked and maintained to make sure that there's clear access through there, particularly prior to any fuel management activities. So if there were any planned burns or operational activities, and prior to the commencement of the fire season, they're done. So it's around removing any overhanging branches, etc., up to about 4.5 meters, because that's the typical height of like a fire tanker, a fire appliance to respond, and making sure that the verges of the roads or the tracks are cleared off as well. So if the trucks do have to drop their wheels off the side, they're not going to hit an unexpected or unseen obstacle in through there. So that may involve some slashing or whippersnippering or those sort of activities along the sides of the roads, particularly to give them that visibility and that clear access along there.
And is that through the joint fuel management program and the strategic fire management plans that you refer to in your specialist assessment?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, thanks. Now, Mr. George, the next few slides of your presentation relate to your response to matters from the committee's RFI. And can I just ask you to proceed through them on the basis you've provided your written response, and then summarise that response on those slides? And if the committee has questions for you about those matters, they'll be put to you, I trust. Yep. And can I ask you then to move forward to your discussion of the incorporated document and EDSs, so we can cover that off.
Yep. So yeah, the incorporated document. So we reviewed that. So that one, the table document 94, we've had a look at that. A few comments on that review. So there's a clause in there around providing a 10-metre buffer. So I think it's important to note that this is providing a defendable space and recognises, I think, that these aren't habitable buildings, or they're not houses that people live in, workplaces, schools, hospitals, those sort of things where people are. So it's not based on a strict assessment using that standard I referred to before, the AS 3959/2018, which is the construction in bushfire prone areas. But it's reflective of those uses. So AS 3959 is used to determine the bushfire attack levels. That takes into consideration your fire danger index, the slope that the vegetation's under, separation distance from the vegetation, and your fuel type or vegetation type to generate the fire behaviour in terms of radiant heat exposure and flame length potential. So this recognises that, again, not habitable building, so a 10-metre space is provided to give that defendable space to allow responding agencies to get in there and to stop that, potentially stop the direct flame contact, but acknowledging that an extended asset protection zone or clearance isn't appropriate in this instance, given the lower risk of the assets and the environmental impacts that could cause. There's some guidelines in there around total fire ban days and restrictions on those. It was referring to construction only, but it should apply to both the construction and operational phases, just to take into consideration there. So we've made some recommendations, changes to EDS BF2 that we'll come to shortly on that. The fire access road plan, the way it's worded now, allows for consideration of segments of that road to be considered as part of the overall strategic network or operational network, but also to take into account that there are other factors and there are other purposes for these roads. So if I can, for example, if I can stop sharing that presentation for a second and share another screen. for example, what this goes to is there's a section through here that is proposed to be upgraded. Now, if it was to be upgraded to the full extent or full requirement of the standards, then these 1A and 2A means it's very light touch. There's minor modifications and changes to the track. So what potentially could happen is you upgrade a section that becomes, a significant upgrade and could handle all sorts of, the transport vehicles that are used to transport dozers, etc. So those really big semi-trailers and trucks. But you can't actually get to that point either way because these lead-up roads haven't been upgraded to that point or haven't been changed to that point. So what this allows is some flexibility to say, well, yes, this is important from an operational perspective for this program and for the environmental watering events. But so you need to meet those standards and the design guidelines for that. It will provide some improved access for fire because it's raised in this case and it's a levee crossing and will give a benefit, but there's no point in doing a full upgrade or to full standards because then you can't get to that point anyway. However, if, for example, if the land manager had said, well, we're actually going to upgrade this part of the road in our forward plan for the next year, which then gets us into, Mickey Swamp Track, if that became a critical point, then it allows the secretary to say, well, yes, it should be upgraded to meet those full standards because then it becomes part of our strategic network. I hope that sort of goes to make some sense or explain.
Is it fair to summarise your position as saying that perhaps while those upgrades wouldn't be required for this project, you'd support the flexibility being included in the incorporated document to allow for that to happen if circumstances change?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask a question of clarification, leading from your clarification then, Mr. Forrester. Does that mean that, so from your question earlier, Mr. Forrester, I understand there are no strategic access tracks at the moment within the project areas?
I was reading from the specialist assessment in terms of the advice from the Dalp Forest Fire Management Victoria. So that's my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Is that right, Mr. George?
That's our understanding, yes.
And I'll just ask Mr. George that the incorporated plan does allow for, or it details standards relating to strategic access tracks. And is that in this, would that be considered in the scenario that you just described, where potentially at some stage in the future, if a track were to be considered for upgrade, that those standards are embedded in it?
Yes, that's correct. And it allows the secretary to consider that. So any works would go to them. They can consider it as part of an overall strategy. And then, that provision is there to apply as appropriate.
Thank you. That's clear. I'll let you continue. I'll hand back to Mr.
Thank you. I'll just switch back to presentation. And then in terms of the operational environmental management plan, and this goes to some of, whoops, sorry, I don't think I'm sharing that. Clause 4.58, so it goes to what I was touching on before. So a notification of those inundation events to allow for that operational planning. So for them to know what access tracks may be inundated or unable to be used and utilised for a period following that watering event. So yeah, we think all those proposed measures are reasonable, sensible and consistent with the EES that we've drafted up, noting that there will be one on the next slide that we're making a recommendation to amend.
So perhaps you've got BF1 on the screen now. I understand you support the drafting of that EDS.
Yes. Yep.
And indeed it was produced, I think, in the course of your preparation of the specialist assessment. Yep. Can I just ask you to go straight to BF2 and I just identify that change that you've recommended for the purpose of ensuring there are guidelines prepared for total fire ban days and fire danger period days?
Yep, perfect. So again, yep, so this one goes to the operation phase. The change here in green is what we've highlighted. So it's preparing those guidelines for the operation or maintenance activities on the total fire ban days and during fire danger period. We think that's an important clarification because there's, on total fire ban days, the fire authorities mandate that certain things cannot be done in terms of activities. So that's, campfires, hot works, those sort of things. There is also, during the fire danger period, the fire danger ratings that are put out each day, and once they become elevated, we think it's important that there's some restrictions put on those to, reduce the potential chance of ignition occurring. So that's why there's the inclusion of that during the fire danger period and picking up the total fire danger, the total fire ban days as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. George. I have no more questions for you, and Madam Chair, that's the evidence in chief.
Thank you, Mr. Forrester and Mr. George. So we'll move straight into questions of cross-examination, and we have a representative from Environment Victoria, Ms. Hogan. Welcome again, and I'll hand directly to Ms. Hogan to ask her questions. Thank you, Mr. George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. George, for your presentation. I just have a few questions this afternoon. Firstly, in relation to traditional owners, can you explain the extent to which your assessment has taken into account specific aspirations and or knowledge of traditional owners in relation to fire management?
Yeah, so it was largely outside of our scope of what we're assessing. We did have some discussions, and our understanding and how we're informed from those was that the involvement of the traditional owners effectively comes through the joint fuel management plan process, and there's informed decisions there. So because as part of the fire assessment and the project, we're not proposing increased burning, we're not proposing those sort of things as part of that. That is, we sort of acknowledge that it occurs through the joint fuel management program and under the guidelines that are in place on that, and also noting that the intent or the purpose behind cultural burning, while it offers some co-benefits in terms of asset protection, it is done for a very different purpose. So not as part of the fire regime in terms of the considerations of what the scope of our works were here.
Thanks, Mr. George. And that leads me on to my next question, which is specifically about cultural burning and the comment that's made in the specialist assessment in, I believe, section 3.7, where you've noted that R8 has not evaluated the potential for application for cultural burning practice as part of the assessment. I was just wondering if you could explain some of the potential risks or implications of not including that as part of the assessment.
So while we haven't specifically considered that as part of the assessment, what we have done is consider the overall bushfire management and mitigation strategies that are in place, and that includes the joint fuel management program, and the cultural burning falls in as part of that program. So while it mightn't be as a standalone consideration, it is considered as part of those ongoing and measures that are in there. We expect that will continue. All the discussions we have with stakeholders is that will continue and continue to be a consideration on any fuel management activities that are in place across the area. So therefore, cultural burning will be considered as part of that.
Thank you. My next question relates to the removal of native vegetation that's proposed as part of the projects. There was a question asked earlier of Mr. Holmes, which you might have heard in relation by Member Bell in relation to the proposed fate of felled native vegetation. Mr. Holmes indicated that at the previous Hatter site, trees were left in situ on the ground, which is done as much as possible to contribute to woody debris for habitat. Is that accounted for in the assessment of bushfire risk at all?
Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit earlier as one of the findings of environmental water through there, where you have those heavier ground fuels, they become, waterlogged effectively. So you raise that fuel moisture content right back up, which makes them harder for fire to consume. And, eventually, obviously, there's a drying out and a drying period as well. But the watering events also, evidence we found was that it will contribute to the decomposition of those timbers. So they'll break down so it has, potentially makes them less available in terms of those heavier fuels in the immediate and shorter term after a flooding event. And then it also assists with the decomposition of them.
Thanks, Mr. George. And has the removal of native vegetation and resulting changes in landscape been factored into the EDSs at all?
Yeah, so there is, I'll just go to, so what we talk about is the minimisation of storage quantities of fuels in the construction phase particularly. So if an area is cleared for whatever reason, that timber is or the vegetation's mulched, that needs to be stored and considered from a fuel perspective of lighting that up, or a potential ignition risk and then fire spread risk as part of that.
Thank you. So that's in the construction phase.
Yep.
Of BF1.
Yep.
Thank you. And just finally, in relation to, two further questions. Firstly, in relation to cumulative effects or impacts of the projects, you've said in the specialist assessment that there's no evidence that there would be cumulative adverse bushfire effects across or between individual project areas. To clarify, does that mean that you have considered cumulative impacts on sites across the Murray River, but outside of the 9 VMFRP sites?
So it goes to that landscape level assessment that we undertook. So it's looking at that 50-kilometre radius that's in there. So that's trying to pick up those landscape fires and how it may influence or affect that. So rather than just the specific sites, it captures that broader area as part of our assessments.
Thank you. And finally, to the extent that you're able to comment, is it correct that if less construction was required at Hatter Lakes North and Belsa-Yongara to deliver environmental water, the overall bushfire risk could be reduced?
It's difficult to comment on that. So what we assessed was, the likely change in the vegetation as a result of any flows, which found, as we've touched on, that flush and through. So that's more around the response to the watering rather than how that gets in there, I think, from a bushfire perspective.
Thanks, Mr. George. Those are my only questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Hogan. And Mr. George, I have a few questions for you from the committee, so I will just go through them. And I've got some notes that I'll just cross-check with your expert witness statement to make sure that I'm taking you to the right spots. So your paragraph 3.3, part A, you did make the comment, we've got there that the expected frequency of the flooding is no more than 2 to 3 times per decade. I just wanted to confirm that whether that's your understanding, or is that what you factored in to your assessment?
yes, that was our understanding of the expected frequency of the watering events. So that was, factored in terms of things like those heavier ground fuels, for instance, and the availability. So something that takes a longer time to dry out. If there's more frequent water in there, then it remains less available for a longer period.
Okay, if the flooding is more frequent in some areas, what will the implications of that be?
It's likely to mean that there is probably less availability of fuels as a result, again, of those fuel moisture contents, of things remaining wetter for longer, and potentially that resilience of species as well. So an improvement, anything that improves the health or resilience of the trees makes them more resistant or able to survive any bushfire events. But again, all the evidence shows that there is very limited fire history and fire occurrence all through there in any event.
Okay, thank you. So paragraph 3.3 part E, you've talked about I'm just going to go to the exact wording. So fuel management treatments, for example, slashing and mulching used to create and maintain breaks of reduced fuel may need to be undertaken more frequently if vegetation within the fuel treatment areas respond to watering by regenerating more quickly. I just wanted to get your view on whether the EDS adequately captures that, or whether the EMF probably more broadly.
Yeah, and I think it is also, it will be addressed through the Joint Fuel Management Program. So what they do, that's a rolling program. They assess the risk of areas on an annual basis, and then it's updated. And that is done, not through, in all instances, a strict overall fuel hazard assessment process, but visual processes or others. And then a prioritisation is done based on what need is where. So if, for instance, there was a really good response and a heavy grass growth and it occurred along a number of the key access tracks and needed to be, then that may result in a need to do those roadways a little bit more often. But it may also mean that in another area that there's less need to do some of the activities that may have been on there because fuels have become less available as well.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask, and apologies if I've overlooked this, but just where the project's management documentation captures that joint fuel management program that you've mentioned?
I might have to take that on notice.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. That might be something the proponent could come back to us on to clarify. Thank you. Just a couple more questions. So I'm interested in the standards that are to be applied to the access tracks, noting the specialist assessment recommends, as we discussed a little bit earlier, that the upgrades should be in line with the DELP standards, and additionally, veg clearance and turning circle passing bays to be implemented with the CFA standards. I just wanted to confirm that the day one version of the incorporated plan that I know you mentioned and that you've reviewed, that it does accurately reflect those DELP standards.
Yeah, I think that goes to the discussion we're having around that flexibility. So it allows for those standards to be applied where appropriate, but also gives flexibility for consideration of other issues such as cultural, environmental, factors where there is no strategic benefit or operational benefit to upgrade a section to that full extent, noting that there will be some complementary benefits just through improvement as a result of the road activities.
Okay, so the tracks that are not currently proposed to become compliant with the DELP standards or those CFA standards, have they been fully identified and you know which ones they are?
Others have been doing some significant work on the roading plans. So I guess from a bushfire perspective, we've sort of identified a requirement, and this is particularly around that need to avoid any of the dead end or roads where there's no possibility to turn or escape in being caught in there. But the overall design has been led by others more specifically, so I'm not across the exact detail of each of them.
Okay, so that work's progressing by the sound of it.
Yeah, as far as I understand. Yep.
Okay, and from a fire management perspective, can I confirm that if there are non-compliant roads, that it is acceptable from a fire management perspective?
Yeah, so it goes to, there'll be access through there, and there is an existing operational network that's through there, and that from all discussions and indications, and I haven't been on the roads, I haven't driven the roads, but from every indication from the land managers that it's an appropriate and enables the response, and the fire history tends to show that. So there's the ability to get response vehicles in there. It may not allow for a full a semi-trailer to come in bringing a dozer, for example, that could be put in containment lines, but the existing road network and trail network allows for those suppression vehicles such as tankers, light units, etc., to get in and respond to any events.
Okay, thank you. My reading of the incorporated plan is that the roads don't need to be compliant with those standards with the exemption from the Secretary. Are you able to explain to me the process for getting that exemption, or maybe something that the proponent could provide some further advice on?
Yeah, I am not across the administrative detail of how that exemption would be.
Okay, no problems, thank you. And noting that you have advised that you're not directly involved in working out which of those access tracks will be non-compliant. My question relates to the cultural values to be avoided. I did ask Ms. Jelly, who's the ecology expert, about that from a vegetation perspective, because we know that that's informed the decisions for some of those roads to be non-compliant. But from a cultural values perspective, could you tell me who's been providing advice on where cultural values should be avoided?
I haven't been provided any advice on that as far as the roads specifically for these sites, or cultural values on that. But I think it goes to the intent or informing decisions that, as part of any operational works or works that are being done, that these should definitely be informing it, and one of the considerations in there.
Okay, thank you. And my final questions relate to the incorporated plan, and I understand that you're generally happy with the proposed changes, subject to the advice that you've given us. Thank you. And I wanted some clarification on the approvals process. So the changes to the incorporated plan in day one remove the need for the relevant fire authority to approve the programs. And I'm just wondering if you understand why that's removed. It may be a wording technicality that I'm confident the proponent will clarify if that's the case, but I'm just wondering if you can provide some advice on the removal of that wording.
No, sorry, I'm unaware. I might have to defer that to the proponent.
Okay, so the day one, I'll just confirm it's in relation to clause 4.11.1 in the day one version.
Madam Chair, I can clarify that now.
Thank you, Mr. Forrester, that would be great.
The clause 4.11.1 has been revised. It was the legal review that influenced this, not Mr. George's work or otherwise, and it's been revised to require the satisfaction of the Secretary, consistently with the balance of the Planning and Environment Act in particular, in respect of who the appropriate body to be providing that satisfaction and approval is, and for the views of the relevant land manager, emergency management and fire authorities to be taken into account by virtue of the consultation process. So that's a matter we can address you on further if need be, but it's a legal review matter.
Okay, thank you. So to be clear, it's not to do with the state forest and fire department or component of that department sitting within the Secretary's department. It's actually a separation of duties where all of those bodies are to be consulted with only, but the final decision to be with the Secretary.
That's right, yes.
Okay, thank you, that's clear. So no further questions from the committee. Thank you very much, Mr. George, and I'll hand you back to Mr. Forrester for any further questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. George, can I just ask one thing by way of a clarification arising from questions put to you by the Chair in question, and that was in respect of the comment in your witness statement around the expected frequency of watering. Do I understand on my review of the specialist assessment that it proceeded on the basis of the operational scenarios for watering identified in the project description chapter?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. So if I turn to the project description chapter, I'll share it for convenience. You can see, for example, here, page 6.23, table 6.10. Do you see that on your screen?
I'll just make it a bit bigger.
I'll try to do that too, sorry.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
If I look at the right-hand column here, additional events delivered by VMFRP and these figures, X years in 10.
Yep.
This is for Balsa Youngera, and there's a table for Hatter Lakes North, which I think extends, I'll just advise you, I think it extends between around 2 and around 4 years in 10. To the extent that you're referring to a range of events, is that the source of the figures, or are they the relevant figures you're referring to?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
So when you're talking about the potential for increase in fines and so on, that's having regard to the potential or anticipated additional events that the projects would deliver over natural.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, we're assuming the changes, like we're trying to assess any changes as a result of the project.
Okay, thanks, Mr. George. That's helpful to have that clarification. And Madam Chair, that's all. That's the evidence of Mr. George.
Thank you very much, Mr. George.
Thanks all.
So we've just gone past 1 o'clock. Mr. Forrester and Mr. Townsend, I know you clarified this morning we'll be getting some written material from you on Monday, but if you could just talk us through if we need to come back after lunch or what your plans are for this afternoon.
It'd be appropriate, our proposal would be to rise for the day now. We'll use the time to continue to prepare those written responses that we're anticipating filing on Monday. But happily, we're through that evidence plan for today, and there's no reason from our perspective to require the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forrester. So just a few closing comments then for today before we do rise, and noting that we will return on Tuesday, so we will not need the reserve day on Monday. So we'll see everybody at 10 a.m. on Tuesday. We do have 2 experts presenting on Tuesday, and I just remind parties, if you're intending to ask questions of cross-examination, to please advise the committee through the PPV office by 4 p.m. on the Monday. I'd also just like to recap, as I mentioned earlier in the week, that we're intending to issue some written questions for DCA that we'll do hopefully later this afternoon with a request for response by the middle of next week. And we will also provide them with invite them to attend the hearing on Friday in preliminary matters next week if the committee has any questions in response to their response. And also the audio recordings for this week, I understand, are underway in terms of being uploaded to the Engage Victoria website. So if they are not there already, they'll be there shortly. So just to let people know that. Are there any other questions for the day?
Can I just identify 2 things before we do close? The first, just by way of information, in respect of the witnesses on Tuesday of next week. We'd intend to cross-examine both and probably in the range of 20 to 30 minutes, but we'll provide that written confirmation to confirm. The other matter that's outstanding, it was a question from the committee about access to the GIS information and system that Ms. Jelly used in the course of her evidence. And we're continuing to work through the precise arrangements for access to that, but we're confident we can get something to the committee, and that'll be something that we also address and confirm in writing for the committee once that's pinned down.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forrester. That's great to know. And I did mention earlier in the week as well that the committee is likely to still have just a number of general questions, and we will collate those into a coordinated format to present or to bring to you early next week, and with time to respond to those.
Thanks, Madam Chair. That'll be excellent.
Thank you. Mr. Decker, I'll come to you. I can see that you have your hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just thought I would acknowledge the note that you would forward through some questions to DECA potentially this afternoon. Would just like to confirm the email address that you will potentially be using for that, and just that's absolutely fine. We'll look forward to those questions. We will be available. I think you mentioned potentially you would like our presence on a particular day. Unfortunately, that didn't quite lock into my memory, but I've got next week scheduled open. And if it would be, I'm sure the questions will touch on the subjects for which you would like us to be present on, but it may be that we require a technical specialist. If, for instance, it was about bushfire, we would bring somebody along from forest fire management. If it was with respect to native vegetation, we would look to bring in a different specialist. So some heads up around what kind of technical expertise you might require, that would be helpful as well.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Decker. At this stage, we propose that the letter will require a written response by Wednesday, and with the opportunity to attend or asking you to attend on Friday morning. If the committee has any questions, we can certainly give you an insight into what those topic areas would be if we do have further questions.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. And I'll come to just check if any other parties have questions. I can see Dr. Kelly has her hand up. I'll come to you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you. I did email the SIAC and got a response about this anonymous report, the expert elicitation. Could the proponent or yourself, Chair, explain that to me, because I still couldn't find it within the tabled documents or even understand what it is talking about. So could that just be quickly clarified?
I will direct you to the documents, Dr. Kelly. And
I was directed to the documents, but I looked at them and still couldn't understand what it was talking about.
Okay, so do you need me to remind you of the document numbers, or you do have access to them?
No, that was emailed to me, but I looked at them and I couldn't understand where anonymous, what was anonymous about.
Okay, Mr. Townsend did provide some commentary around that earlier in the week.
I did not understand him. I did go to listen and I couldn't understand.
Did you have a specific question, Dr. Kelly?
What topic was that anonymous report on? Like, I can't even grasp that.
Okay. I think at this stage, Dr. Kelly, I'll just take that. We'll just note your question. Mr. Townsend and the proponents team will be coming back to us next week, and we'll take the opportunity to explain answers to questions. So I'll just put that in the list, Mr. Townsend, when you're actually providing us with some submission, if you're able to expand on your position in relation to the expert elicitation report, that would be helpful. And if Dr. Kelly needs any further clarification at that point, she can raise that issue then. Thank you.
I think my concern is this is the first EES I've ever been participated in, and I don't understand the terminology of expert elicitation. I don't know. So I'm just a bit confused. So
okay, thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.
No, not a problem. And I understand there's a lot to take in, and there's some unfamiliar terminology as well. So perhaps have another look at that. I know that the recording is available for last week when Mr. Townsend, I think it was last week's recording, and you can ask the team, Dr. Kelly, if you do need further direction on where to re-listen to that section, if that is at all helpful. And just to note as well that there were multiple authors in that report. So I know you've just referred to it as the one with the anonymous author. There was one, it's noted that the one person was remaining anonymous. So thank you. Any further questions before we do rise for the day? No, fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy a few days of non-sitting, and look forward to seeing you all at 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Thank you.